We are live. All right. Phil, what is up?
How you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to chat about all things Astro with you today.
Yes, indeed.
I suppose for folks who don't know us, we should do brief introductions.
Sure, why not?
Before we give some context here. So I'm Sean C. Davis and leading the developer education team at Netlify, and I'll give us a little bit more background about what we want to talk about here in a minute, but give you a chance to introduce yourself, Phil.
Yeah, so thank you very much. Yeah, I'm Phil Hawksworth, and I'm a member of Sean's team, part of the developer education team. I've been a bit of an advocate for Netlify for a long time. Actually, thinking about it, both of us have. We were both kind of Netlify advocates before joining Netlify to do kind of advocacy things and education things here, but I know we've both been building things for the web for a long time. So, yeah, that's me as well. Part of my background is in looking at technical architectures and trying to find simple ways to build sites, and really, like you, Sean, I think just kind of a lover of the web, and if that doesn't sound like too much of a web hippie. And so yeah, part of the team here at Netlify, building out developer resources and trying to help people learn how to build things on the web with Netlify.
From your perspective, why did we choose Astro?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and I think whenever we try and decide what tool we're going to use, we need to start first of all with what's the thing we're making. What are the functional, non-functional requirements of the thing? And so we should probably just talk about DevHub a little bit, because it's in many ways it has a lot of characteristics of a blog. It's potentially a blog site. It's where we publish guides and articles for developers to figure out how to use different tools and resources and ways of building things on the web. So there's a bunch of articles, and it's going to have all of the kind of characteristics of a blog in terms of tags and authors and articles and collections and those kind of things. But then there's a couple of other bits and pieces on there as well. So we wanted to have the ability to kind of aggregate some other content in there, because there's all kinds of things happening around the Netlify ecosystem or web properties or whatever terms we want to use. But it'd be nice to have a way of pulling those all together into one place, so we can kind of surface feeds of different things and different activity there, so it can create a bit of a one-stop shop. But ultimately, we're building a site which is going to be read often and written less often. So it's a publishing site rather. It's not an application. There's no transactions happening there, but of course we still want it to feel very interactive and very kind of dynamic. But ultimately, it's a publishing platform. So that kind of led us to some of the kind of functional requirements that we might expect. But of course, we also care about what's the developer experience, which is not as important as the user experience. Of course, I always feel like I need to say that, because we forget that so often, because we're developers and we're like, what toys do we get to play with? What fun can we have while making it? How easy is our life going to be? And of course, that's important, but never as important as the user experience. But yeah, so we were thinking about what's it going to be like building and maintaining this thing. We had recently made a move for Netlify.com as well. That's now an Astro site as well. So there's other art happening at the organization with other development teams building with Astro as well. So it's nice to have have some similar tools being used. I think it's fair to say that every site doesn't have to use the same stack, though, after, just to qualify what I said a second ago, because different sites have different needs and purposes. So we should choose the right tool for the job. But if it can be the same tool, then all the better. But yeah, we really wanted to have a slick authoring experience, a slick development experience, and enough kind of guardrails to keep us structured and organized, and creating a site that would be very performant, have good kind of web standards, have good reliability, so if we could create something which was generated as assets that we could serve from the Netlify CDN, all the better, rather than having something which is dynamic. We add things that are dynamic and rendered on the fly if you need them, but not until you need them. And I think a site like this, can enjoy the benefits of being pre-generated. So Astro gives us that opportunity. And there's all kinds of other kind of bells and whistles along the way that we can talk about as we get into the weeds. But for me, I think, we started with the functional requirements and figured out this is a richer blog, effectively. So it's going to be something that's read much more often than it's written. So we want to be able to kind of have that flow and create something that's just going to be very, very stable and very, very performant and easy to host.
Yes, exactly. I was thinking really that there were two main drivers, and one was definitely the piece that you had mentioned on, because marketing had also done this analysis and was in the process of rebuilding our www site, that there was an opportunity to really build off of the work that they've done and learn a lot from the work that they've done. So that was a huge benefit,
right?
But it really shouldn't be the only benefit, because like you said, we have to consider what we're building. And what I was thinking about earlier today is that if we took that decision we had to make and the same set of requirements, but we moved back, say, a year or two before Astro really felt like it could handle a growing production site, I think that decision would have been much harder, because I had to make that decision several times over those years, 2020, 2021 or so. And generally what I found was, what my instinct was to go toward a tool like Eleventy for a lot of these simple content sites. And I loved Eleventy. I still love Eleventy today. I think it serves a handful of use cases really strongly. And that was kind of like one bucket. But then there's the other bucket, which is if you needed more dynamic or interactive capabilities, you had a lot more tools in your toolbox if you would go with something like Next.js. And then what I had found was, as sites grow in complexity, it's like not so much in traffic, because if we're hosting on Netlify, I feel like the traffic becomes a lot less of a concern, but more so just as the code base becomes more complex. Right. Eleventy sites generally just get really difficult to manage, at least for me. This has happened with me in my personal site. And whereas Next.js is already kind of, by relying on React and with some of its underlying tools, it's already kind of built to scale. And so what I found myself doing was just going to Next immediately if I felt like, okay, this project is going to grow in complexity within the first couple of years. I don't want to have to replatform again. But in those early years, it just felt wrong. It was like, okay, but I'm going to have a handful of content that is, like you said, it's not written very much. It's consumed a lot. Now I'm going to force every user to download a ton of JavaScript just to be able to read this blog post. And it never really sat right for me. It felt really good for more dynamic applications, but not for blog type sites. And so when Astro came around, it was like, I felt like we had the best of both worlds. I could fully understand and have complete visibility into the exact structure of the HTML that I am shipping to the page. And I have full control over the amount of JavaScript I ship to the page, which those are two direct similarities to what we would get with something like Eleventy. But this is a tool that is built on a component-based framework. So I feel like it's got the tools that we need to be able to scale. And then I think, and we can dig into some of these details, but I feel like the developer experience is very important to that team. So this first-class support for TypeScript, and I mean, even as simple as, hey, they introduced a new templating language, but also they don't ship that without making sure that, hey, there's a VS Code extension so that you get syntax highlighting and you can just move really quick while you're building these things.
Yeah, that details like that do actually make such a big difference just to the quality of life while you're developing. And I'm really impressed with the amount of attention to detail that's gone into the development of the developer experience. You know, the CLI is amazing. Things like the VS Code extension and what have you, those make it feel like a very established. I mean, it is well established, but it's always felt to me like a very established framework tool because of the quality of some of those kind of touch points for the developers. And you called something out there which I think is absolutely critical about the ability to opt in, and the fact that you don't by default ship lots of JavaScript to the client. It takes a lot for me to decide not to use Eleventy on something. I'm a huge Eleventy fan. And I often think that there's a whole raft of types of sites and experiences that we can build from the web for the web that that don't actually need a lot. And so you need to opt into these things. And I think that, I've been using 11T for very many things for a long time, and I think you can go a long way with it. However, as you mentioned, we've got other people around the organization building in other things and building in Astro, and also we've got people building with React and all sorts of other frameworks that we can choose to use within Astro should we need to. So I really like the fact that the ceiling gets much higher. However, we don't need to be standing up there, bumping our heads against that ceiling from the outset. We can start just as simply as we like. And I think that's one of the design decisions that I really love about Astro that makes it very, very palatable to me. The fact that by default, it doesn't ship with everything and you have to opt into things. The difference between getting things automatically, whether you need them or not, and they're there under the surface for the really powerful things that you might want to build, versus you have to decide to turn these things in and opt into them, I think is a really important and valuable design decision, because it means that as a developer, you become so much more deliberate about what you turn on and what you enable and the reasons for doing that, which I think is just a much more thoughtful way of building for the web that makes it a much more future-proof project, because you've made a call to add complexity whenever there is any complexity in there. And, by default, building with Astro, it can be very, very simple, and you're building a very, very simple set of things where you're turning content and templates into HTML. Perfect. Give me the tools to do that, and I'll be happy for a very, very long time, up until the point that we need to actually add something that is a bit more like a component-based architecture, or is a bit more like having something dynamic at runtime as well. And then we can gradually dial things up and turn those things on. And I think that's just a really nice approach. And it's felt really good on this project, the fact that we started simple, which meant we went from 0 to something that was very functional very, very quickly. And then gradually over time, we started embellishing that. So that's felt like a really nice, successful approach to me. And I'm very pleased with the choice of tool for those reasons.
Yes, 100% agree. And something that has always struck me as I still have no answer for this. I'm still impressed by it. Is that okay? If we go back to like the early days of Astro, and at the time there was 11D, and then I forget the name, but there was an extension or a plugin that the community was working on that would enable you to use React components and Vue components, etc., with 11D. Mm-hmm. And then when Astro lands, at first it just kind of felt like, well, is this a one-to-one comparison? Like, is this a little bit different? And I recall talking to Zach Leatherman, founder of 11D, in the past, and he has this great phrase that I love, which is the time to hello world. And what 11D gives you is this right out of the box. You can ship a site to production. It's so fast. It's so simple. It's an amazing experience. And so Astro also had some form of that as well in its early days. And I recall this feeling that I had when Astro starts going heavier toward server-side rendering as an option. So they have this kind of hybrid rendering pattern that you can opt into, as you suggested. And when that feature landed, I was very skeptical. I was like, okay, but you've taken the simple static approach, and now it seems like you're also trying to solve this case where I could build this highly complex dynamic application with it, and you can't do both great. There is no possible way that you can do both of these things great. And yet here I am. And if we have a simple site like the Dev Hub, Astro is serving us perfectly well today. On the other hand, I'm working on another project that is highly dynamic. We're using server-side rendering on every single page. It has authentication. It taps into a database. And Astro has been an amazing experience. I don't know how they're doing it or how they've managed to find this balance of priority, but they've got some magic secret sauce there in their process, and it's working really well.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing that I've really come to enjoy, and actually it's something that I was hungry for and I would really miss if I didn't have access to it. And I know that Astro isn't the only tool that has this, but it does it really nicely, is just having single file components.
Yes.
Once upon a time, the idea of having a separation of concerns around kind of style and content and behavior, and those live in different places. I kind of understand why we did that. But when we think about how, when our mental model for the sites that we're building, the experiences we're building, it makes much more sense for these components to have those three things together. And it's so much easier to reason about that. So having a build pipeline that allows you to have single file components, which then compile down, if you will, or rather, generate down into the HTML, CSS, JavaScript that you need and in the right way, in an efficient way, is really nice. And the fact that we can start building out kind of specific components that we can share around, the site and with other projects, as we're starting to work more with the other teams around Netlify who are building things with Astro, we've got so many opportunities to share components around between us. And that's a really nice enabler. And it feels like it really helps me understand, how the site is developing, what tools there are to be able to build out the experiences as we're kind of gradually adding these components that we can use. And I really would miss that if I didn't have single file components these days.
Yes, we're going to start to put those to work here in the very near future as we're looking to rebuild our documentation site. And with the work that we've done on the Dev Hub, we've worked in conjunction with our marketing and brand team that have helped us develop Netlify developers sub-brand. So we want to pull that into the documentation site. Now, our doc site will serve a different purpose than the Dev Hub site does today. But what we really want is this cohesive experience for developers who are consuming content on any one of our content properties. And so we want to adapt that style, share as much code as we can. And like you just suggested, it's great. So there will be different components that are mutually exclusive to each site, but there are a lot of components that are reusable across the brand, like callouts or code blocks and those sort of things. And so we can build those once, we can have this shared package, and then we can have however many disparate sites where the code block just works. And then we level up the features maybe in the code block. Like we're going to add a copy button that will copy the code to your clipboard. Well, we do that in one place. Now all of our sites all of a sudden have this leveled up code block. And we haven't quite seen that pay off yet, but I'm really excited because I think within the next 6 months or so, we're really going to start to feel that.
Yeah, totally. I think there's another aspect as well, which is lent to the success of Astro and has lent to the feeling of confidence you have building with it. And it's not a technical thing. It's a human thing. I think the community is amazing. I think the community is very active, very engaged, and feels very positive and productive. And that doesn't happen on its own, and I think that the teams work very hard to kind of foster that. But I also think that the community felt like it ramped up from, there's another player on the, on the block. It's got a cool logo. The documentation reads well. Let's have a guy. It's quite nice. And then, that at this very, very first kind of inception, it was like, that's nice. Look at it over there. And it just kind of, took off is an unfortunate a pun that I didn't avoid, but I didn't intend either. But it really did take off very, very quickly. And I think that's in part due to the way that it was kind of nourished and cared for by the kind of the team working on Astro. But I think also the fact that Astro has lots of commonalities with React. You can use React in it, and so it kind of feels at home to people who've been building things with React, but then also didn't force developers to go all in. And I think it was a slightly nicer kind of on-ramp to be able to use some of those things, but it wasn't a sledgehammer to crack a nut. And so I think that has probably caught the imagination of a very large community already, and then kind of given that community some tools to do the kind of things that they were excited about in the first place. So I think that's really jump-started the community. And so now there's so much support, there's so much activity, and it's a really thriving community. So I think that always helps a project like this kind of give confidence to those using it, which is a big deal when making a choice about a tool.
100%. Absolutely. And there's a related idea that I was curious to get your take on, because I also think it's why the community has blown up quite a bit. This came up in an interview I did a couple months ago. And what we were talking about is the feeling that you get when you're developing with Astro. And to kind of set the stage here, let's back up for a minute and talk about what it's like to work with a truly static site generating framework like a Jekyll or Hugo or Eleventy. Netlify offers a wide array of these platform primitives that let you do a lot more than just present static content. Like we have the blob storage, we have edge functions where you can manipulate the request or the response based on the request, or just serverless functions that can provide API-like routes for your site. So if you just need a little bit more dynamic capabilities, you can still use some of those more traditional tools. But if you have to do that with, kind of outside of the context of the framework in a way. So if I'm building a Hugo site and I want this API route, then I'm going to create a Netlify functions directory, and it's very specific to Netlify, which is great and it works. Huge boost for folks building with Hugo. With Astro and with the adapter that we've built at Netlify for Astro, what I've talked to developers about is that they don't really feel like Netlify is playing a role in their or just any platform where they're deploying it. But let's say that Netlify is playing a role in that developer experience. So when I'm developing an Astro site, I am fully embedded in Astro and I get all of these framework features. And then because of the work that we've done on the adapter at Netlify, you'd go and you deploy with Netlify and it just works in production. So you get this one-to-one behavior and you don't have to do anything specific. I can't really speak to what that experience is like to deploying to other platforms, but at least with the folks I've talked to deploying to Netlify, that's been their experience. But they love that all of the work that they do with the code is generally contextualized to Astro. And I'm curious if you've had a similar experience.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's a really important point to say that we want Astro to just kind of work perfectly on Netlify. However, Astro isn't a Netlify project, right? With two different entities, two different organizations. So, it's very important, I think, that there's that we're decoupled, so that the future of Netlify and the future of Astro don't completely depend on one another, or rather the future of your project, if you're using Astro on Netlify, is you can, please don't go, but if you needed to, you could pick up your project and take it to another provider. And I think that's a hugely important buying criteria, knowing that you're not going to be stuck in a single place or stuck on a single framework. The fact that you can mix and match how you need to is really important. However, we also want it to feel like it's just perfectly integrated and it could have been built by the same organization. And so that's what we're always shooting for. And so you kind of mentioned these primitives that we've kind of exposed in Netlify so that people can, build out experiences with whatever tools they want and then kind of get to the platform primitives and do things that can be, pretty complex and pretty deep and have a lot of control. Or they can leverage that via frameworks such as Astro, who have taken that burden on for you and said, okay, well, we'll integrate that for you. And they've done so with, however they need to do that, and that added that kind of abstraction. So you just do what you need to do as a developer, and it hashtag just works. And so I think that's a really, really important pattern. But knowing that, we've provided those primitives so Astro can do what it needs to do on behalf of the developer using it is kind of key, as opposed to, we've built these two things together. Astro isn't built into the platform in Netlify, and Netlify hasn't been built to feed Astro. We're thinking about things in a bit more of a generalized and agnostic and kind of standardized way. And I think that's a really important pattern, and one that Astro seems to be leveraging really, really beautifully at the moment. So it makes it a lot of fun to use.
100%. Yes, fun. Fun. It's a great way to summarize it. It's a really enjoyable experience working with Astro. So I feel like my go-to tool has changed, and now because somehow they've solved the very simple site and the complex site within one framework. We'll see other frameworks hit the scene, of course. There was a time where it felt like there was another JavaScript-based framework every week, but I think it's going to take a lot to convince me to move away for whatever that case might be.
Yeah, totally. And I think we're seeing more and more interesting capabilities and use cases that leverage Astro all the time. And over time, on the Dev Hub, which is the site we're talking about just for the context of this, but the content that goes on there, that's changing all the time as well. So we'll see more and more examples of using Astro to do a specific thing or learn how to use a specific feature of Astro. We'll see those details of how to do that surfacing on the Developer Hub more and more over time. So I think that's the place to kind of keep an eye on things there. We'll always be adding more content that explains how to get more and more out of the framework and do more and more with the tools. So I'm excited to see what's going to happen over time because, as you say, we haven't invented everything yet, and so we're keen to see what gets invented and how the tools get applied. So it's going to be an interesting future, I think. Yes.
So for those folks out there watching, keep an eye on how developers.netlify.com and docs.netlify.com transform in the very near future here. But Phil, thanks for the chat. I love talking to you as always, and I feel like we could go on and on and on about.
We should, likewise. We should take some of this conversation into the pull requests of the site and like ship some more features. That's what we should probably do.
Absolutely. And speaking of, there is a form on the developer site. So if all of you out there are reading one of those guides and you think, hey, you could add a new component and change it. It would be great if this site had this thing. Yeah, drop it in there. We're always listening to new ideas and constantly making iterations on it.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Great. Thanks, Phil.
See ya. Bye.
Bye.